name's Kenny May, and I'm here today to interview my grandpa for my social studies project.
And don't fuck.
Grandpa, how old were you when you were in the war?
I was 24 when I enlisted, and I was overseas for about 2.5 years. I was about 25, 26 years old at that time. Infantry.
Where did you train?
Well, I trained in South Carolina, and then I got promoted and went to a place called Appalachian Hills, and then I was promoted and went to Officer Candidate School at Fort Benning, Georgia. That's a school of infantry, and I graduated there. I was one of 75 people that graduated out of class of 275. And I might mention I was the oldest old man in that class. Most of them were young college students and so forth.
Where did you serve during the war?
Well, we started out in England, and then we finally ended up in France for quite a long period of time, and then into Germany, just prior to the fall of Hitler at that time. We passed through a couple of other countries, but primarily that was our main station all throughout the entire European campaign.
How did you get to Europe?
Well, that's quite a story to tell because of the fact that we boarded this small boat, and I looked at the chart, and it was the SS Mexico, which held 125 people. By actual count, we had over 1,100 people on that boat, soldiers, and we took off in the middle of the night. And the next morning, we got up and looked, and we saw the biggest fleet that ever went over to Europe. There were more boats, submarines, destroyers, aircraft carriers. It was the largest flotilla that ever went to Europe to fight the war. Now, on the boat itself, actually, there were so many people on the boat that they lined up for breakfast, and when they got through with breakfast, they lined up and had dinner. There was no lunch, and everybody was practically naked because it was so hot in this boat that we were at. It took us approximately 14 days to get to England. And prior to getting there, the boat separated, and some went their different ways, and we ended up in Wales, England at that time.
How was the food on the boat?
The food wasn't bad at all. We had mostly rations. And of course, I was very, very fortunate because, believe it or not, I had a small cabin. And the reason for it was the fact that prior to our leaving, I left about 4 o'clock in the morning, and they took me down to the Brooklyn Navy Yards, and they gave me $225,000. I walked in this room, and all I saw was money, money, money. And the whole idea behind it was the fact they didn't want an American soldier to land in the foreign soil and not have any money to spend. So as a result, I had to pay each man on that boat. And before he left, he got what we call a partial payment. And I was responsible for the money in the safe. In fact, I still got the receipts of the money that I turned back in. But other than that, it was the Army's intention that the GI had money to spend. Of course, it was taken out of his pay the following month. But sometimes, some of them didn't get paid for 2 or 3 months because we were on the move most of the time.
I know you're a banker.
It wasn't a question of being a banker, but every boat and every ship that left port that day and from there on, it was one officer was appointed to be the paymaster. I didn't have the title paymaster, it's just a coined phrase, because I was a lieutenant in the infantry at that time, but I was selected from a group of officers to serve the purpose of paying the men money.
For duty in the war.
Well, this goes back to the time I was graduating from Fort Benning, Georgia, that the Army at that time had made a big decision that they would set up what they would call a morale unit or a special service unit, of which I was not familiar with. And after I got my commission, they, because of the background that I had in athletics and sports and supervising playgrounds and so forth, and because I had the infantry training, it was required that an infantry officer be assigned to this special unit group. And it was a morale unit. So they sent me to college, to Washington Lee University, and I was there for 4 months, learning the morale factor and what our job was supposed to be. And as it turned out, it was my duty. When I joined the company, I was the only infantry officer, and I had to train them in infantry tactics. Now, we were not a combat outfit. We were not a combat unit. However, the men had to be trained in the event they had to enter the war. And this came we came very, very close on the siege in Belgium. But other than that, our job was to arrange athletic affairs for the troops that were in rest areas, assign units, movie units to the combat, in the combat zone, where we'd have a group of 4 or 5 trucks, vehicles at our disposal, and they would go into the combat area and show movies to the GIs. And then, of course, the USO shows would come, and it was our responsibility to make sure that we got into the combat zone and had the GIs see these stars. For example, I had Mr. Jimmy Cagney, quite a famous movie star, for approximately 2 weeks. And apparently I was so good in walking with him, I had to take care of this man for about 2 weeks. And of course there was Mickey Rooney, the movie star also. He was over there. These were just a couple of the people that joined with our unit. We were responsible for their welfare and their safety and everything else. So consequently, our troops had to be trained, because in entering combat zone, they had to know how to handle their equipment and so forth. But primarily, that was our job, was to improve the morale of the troops, keep them up to date on the war news. We used to get special reports in which we related the troops every night. We would have a news orientation period for them. And then, of course, I arranged boxing matches between the different units, baseball games. In fact, I could have stayed over there with about 4 other promotions I could have gotten. But primarily, that was our job.
Were you scared in the war?
I think everybody that was in service at that time was scared, and really scared. For example, we were stationed 6 months in Southampton, England, when the Germans would send over buzz bombs. These were timed bombs that flew in the air, and they would stall and then accelerate again. And we had something like 60,000 troops down there at that time, ready for the invasion of France. And that's one time that I can say we were scared. The second time was just prior to the invasion. We were told the Germans were going to use gas. So we had to put on these oily skin clothing, which sunk to high heaven. You couldn't breathe. They were helmets plus the uniforms itself. And thirdly, I think probably the worst scare I ever had was we were living in a castle at the time down there. The officers were in the castle and the men were in tents about a mile away. And all of a sudden, the German planes started coming over, and from a position we were at, we would look out, and I would say probably 500-600 yards away, the AT guns went off, the Bofor guns, and it looked like those bullets were going to come right through the window with the tracers. A tracer means that about every 5th bullet that is shot, it lights up to let them know where the target is. And that was really scary. So then we got informed that there were a bombing raid going on, so then we had to run outside and get in the foxholes. And I can be truthful with you, I was so scared I bit my fingers. And we stayed in there for about a half hour, 45 minutes, until the raid was over. I would say everybody that either was in a combat zone or even close to it was scared. And I was mightily scared several times.
Grandpa, did you have to walk or did you ride in a truck?
Well, the platoon that I was in charge with, we had about 4 or 5 heavy-duty trucks. And you're probably thinking about Jeeps when you talk about the Army. Well, we weren't authorized a Jeep, but I had a very, very smart mechanic. His name was Sergeant Royer. I'll never forget him, from Ligonier, Pennsylvania. And he came up to me one day and he said, Lieutenant, he said, I just found a Jeep that the front end had been bombed it, and the rear end is good on it. So if you'd like, I'll put 2 and 2 together and build you a Jeep. And I said, fine, go ahead and build me a Jeep. So we just put some numbers on the Jeep so we could get gas. And when my company commander heard about me having a Jeep, he got kind of mad. But even though he was 75 to 80 miles away from me, I still kept a Jeep, and I named it my Butch. And that was for my girlfriend back home, hoping she'd still be waiting for me. And that's your grandma. So I named it for that. I used to call her Butch, not because she was fat and flabby, you know, but she was quite a gal. She waited for me.
Anybody over in Europe that you knew?
Yes, I did. It was quite an experience. I met my brother, who I hadn't seen in about 3 years or so. And it just happened. I was going to a movie one night, and I wore my nameplate. And this young GI came up to me and said, your name May? And I said, yeah. And I said, do you know anybody by the name of May? And he said, yes, I do. He said, he gave me the name of a hospital. He said his name was Robert May, and he was from Michigan. So I felt pretty good. It sounded to me like that would be my brother. And he was in pretty bad shape. But the next morning I took off for there, and that was about in Chateau Thierry, which is quite a very, very famous battleground of World War I. And I found him in the hospital there. So I spent about 2 days there with him at that time. And he was completely shell-shocked from being in combat. He was in combat for probably, well, since the start of the war over there. So, and I hadn't seen him in about 3 years because he was in Iceland before he went to Europe. And he had some real horrible tales to tell, but he finally got better. So that was really nice to see him.
What'd you do for fun?
Well, we played baseball and things like that there, pretty much the same as we did at home. Touch football and so forth. I think probably if you're talking about fun, I might explain the experience that happened to me that didn't quite turn out to be fun. As it was, I picked up a couple of GIs that were bumming a ride, and they mentioned the fact that there were some GIs from my old hometown on Clemens, Michigan in their camp. So the next day I went back, and I met several of the fellows I went to school with and so forth. And one was a hotshot pilot, and he was a pilot of the B-26 Mosquito bomber. And he asked me if I'd like to go on a bomb run with him. So I said yes. And talk about scared, and it wasn't funny either. We went over the target and we dropped some bombs. And then he suggested I lay in the front on my stomach in the front of the plane with my face up close to the plexiglass. And as I did, he started to maneuver and dive. And we dove into about 3 or 4 concentration camps. And you never saw so many scared Germans in your lives. And he also chased a few cows down the pasture and a few horses. And the farmers would come out and shake their arms at him and everything else. And that was really scary, very scary, but it was a thrill that I really enjoyed.
I forgot.
We arrived in the United States, believe it or not, on July 4th, 1945. And I was still in service at that time, because a month later, we were on our way to the West Coast on a railroad cars on our way to Japan. And we were very fortunate because after our equipment was all on the boat and we were just ready to leave, the war in Japan had ended. And as a result, we returned back to Fort Meade, Maryland, and then I was discharged there. And that was in December 1945.
Thanks, Grandpa, for helping me with my social studies project.
You're welcome, son. There.